The Sunday school lessons for May 25th, 2025 are A Covenant Renewal and Here We Go Again. Nehemiah chapter 10, verses 28 through 39. This is an audio reading of the lesson with intermittent commentary. Verse 28. The rest of the people, priests, Levites, gatekeepers, musicians, temple servants, and all who separated themselves from the neighboring peoples for the sake of the law of God, together with their wives and all their sons and daughters who are able to understand. The identifiers here are sometimes distinctive, sometimes overlapping. The Levites, those descended from the tribe of Levi, were solely in charge of the items and duties associated with the tabernacle and temple. However, they were not included in a census of Israelites and did not receive an inheritance of land. All priests were Levites, but not all Levites were priests. The word translated gatekeepers is also translated doorkeepers in 1 Chronicles 15 and 24, and that is the same sense here. It was one of the specific jobs of certain Levites. The word musicians include those skilled in vocal music, instrumental music, or both. These same four identifiers are repeated in Ezra and Nehemiah. Older versions of the Bible include the word Nethinims in place of the phrase temple servants. The word is a transliteration, not a translation. That's where a word in one language is brought over into another language simply by swapping the original language letters of the word into the letters that sound the same in the other language. The temple servants first make their appearance in post-exilic times. They were part of a group that numbered 392 who returned during the first wave from exile. The clue to their function as temple servants is found in Ezra 8 and 20. That text also gives us a precise numbering of those who returned in the second wave. They also brought 220 of the temple servants, a body that David and the officials had established to assist the Levites. In short, the entire workforce of the temple appears on this list. The priests carried out the sacrifices. The Levites cleaned up and made sure things ran properly. The gatekeepers provided security and ensured proper traffic flow. Separation from the neighboring peoples for the sake of the law of God is a key theme in this book. Verse 29. All these now join their fellow Israelites, the nobles, and bind themselves with a curse and an oath to follow the law of God given through Moses, the servant of God, and to obey carefully all the commands, regulations, and decrees of the Lord, our Lord. People of all occupations and demographics swore an oath to commit themselves to following the law of Moses. That law, given about 1,000 years prior to the writing of this verse, specified the curse for disobedience. The people seem to have been binding themselves to suffering the punishments listed therein should they disobey. The law of Moses seems to have been ignored and violated more times than it had been honored over the 10 centuries since its giving. It may be tempting to put the three words commands, regulations, and decrees under individual microscopes to detect different shades of meaning, but that would be to miss the forest for the trees. The idea, rather, seems to be to leave no requirement out. The three words in the original language are found together in 9 other places. Verses 30 through 31. We promise not to give our daughters in marriage to the peoples around us or take their daughters for our sons. When the neighboring peoples bring merchandise or grain to sale on the Sabbath, we will not buy from them on the Sabbath or on any holy day. Every 7th year, we will forego working the land and will cancel all debts. In verse 30, we see that the danger of intermarriage is specified in Exodus 34:16 and Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 3 through 4. The threat was that of resulting idolatry. When the Lord tests the Israelites in this regard, they failed. Judges 3, verses 1 through 6. And this is where King Solomon erred and suffered accordingly. 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 1 through 13. This prohibition helped to mark the boundary between God's holy people and the pagan gods' unholy peoples. One might think that such marriage might allow for the conversion of the pagan spouse to Judaism. The book of Ruth offers an example of this happening, but that seems to have been the very rare exception. Ezra, the teacher of the law, had arrived in Jerusalem in 458 BC, according to Ezra chapter 7, verse 8. Intermarriage and the resulting idolatry seems to have been the most significant problem he noticed. The entirety of Ezra chapter 9 addresses the problem itself. The entirety of Ezra 10 records the confession of this sin and the names of the guilty. Nehemiah confronted the same problem about 25 years later. Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 6 and verses 23 through 27. Verse 31. The longest of the Ten Commandments is fourth, which concerns keeping the Sabbath. The Israelites had been warned about failing to honor that day as God had prescribed. Their failure in that regard was a factor in their exile. The pagan neighboring peoples cared nothing for the Sabbath. Conducting commerce with them showed that God's covenant people cared nothing for it either. As the text moves from the Sabbath to any holy day, the movement is from specific to general. Any day the Lord declares holy is such. The most frequent of these is the day of the new moon. Last week's lesson. To decline to engage in commerce on the Sabbath required some advanced planning and even temporary hardship. However, it also resulted in a day of rest. Exodus chapter 31, verse 15. If God himself decided that it was good for him to rest one day out of 7, who are we to think otherwise? The weekly Sabbath had a counterpart in the Sabbath of every seventh year. That was a time when all debts owed to a fellow Israelite were to be canceled. Deuteronomy chapter 15, verses 1 through 3. The sabbatical seventh year was also the year to leave the fields unsown and unplowed. Whatever the land produced on its own that year would be sufficient for both poor and not so poor alike. Those Hebrews who were working as indentured servants for their fellow Israelites were to be set free in their seventh year. With the passage of 7 cycles of 7 years came the year of Jubilee in the 50th year, with special rules applying. The practice of periodically eliminating personal debts was known elsewhere in the ancient Near East. It was seen as a way of ensuring that grave inequalities among people did not worsen with time. Since their world had no banks, loans usually came from neighbors or the temple. These loans were designed to help the borrower survive. The forgiveness of debt was, therefore, a deeply personal act and a way of addressing social imbalance among neighbors. Verse 32. We assume the responsibility for carrying out the commands to give a third of a shekel each year for the service of the house of our God. Verse 32 begins a list of obligations the people agree to for temple upkeep and ongoing operations. The first item is the annual temple tax. A shekel was a silver coin weighing about 3/8 of an ounce. At a modern exchange rate of, say, $25 per ounce of silver, a third of a shekel would equate to no more than $5. But the changing levels of supply and demand for silver, like other precious metals, fluctuate through time. Thus, a comparison with modern exchange rates, while interesting, may be misleading. A better approach is to investigate what could actually be purchased with a shekel, although this too will fluctuate. Placed on a timeline, the concept and implementation of the temple tax can be traced back to Exodus chapter 30, verses 11 through 16, and forward to Matthew chapter 17, verses 24 through 27. Verse 33, for the bread set out on the table, for the regular grain offerings and burnt offerings, for the offerings on the Sabbaths, at the new moon feasts, and at the appointed festivals, for the holy offerings, for sin offerings, to make atonement for Israel, and for all the duties of the house of our God. This verse itemizes expenses incurred for the functioning of the temple. To modern eyes, this may all seem to be a lot of repetition, but we need to keep a chronological framework in mind. By Nehemiah's day, the second temple had been completed about 70 years prior in 516 BC. Thus, at least one generation had passed off the scene, and those who followed needed instruction. Therefore, these reminders: bread, Leviticus chapter 24, verse 6, regular offerings, Leviticus chapters 1 through chapter 2, Numbers 28, 1 and through 8, Sabbaths, Numbers chapter 28, verses 9 through 10, and Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 12 through 15. New moons, Numbers chapter 10, verse 10, and chapter 28, verses 11 through 15. Appointed festivals, Leviticus chapter 23, and Numbers chapter 28, verses 16 through chapter 29, verse 40. And sin offerings, Leviticus chapter 4, verses 1 through chapter 5, verse 13. Verse 34, we, the priests, the Levites, and the people have cast lots to determine when each of our families is to bring to the house of our God at set times each year a contribution of wood to burn on the altar of the Lord our God, as it is written in the law. Leviticus chapter 6, verses 12 through 13 specifies that the fire on the altar of the Lord's sanctuary must never go out. That requirement demanded a lot of wood. The payment in wood, therefore, became a shared responsibility. With no objective means for assigning this rotating task, the selection method is to cast lots. This method of leaving the choice up to the Lord is seen also in the choosing of the scapegoat, allocation of land, division of duties, and identifying an individual. Verse 35, we also assume responsibility for bringing to the house of the Lord each year the first fruits of our crops and of every fruit tree. The foundation of the offering of the first fruits is found in Exodus chapter 13, verse 1, 22 and 29, 25 and 19, and number 17, verses 12 through 13. The idea is that when a harvest starts, the very first of that harvest goes to God for temple support. Given the first of the harvest demonstrated trust in God that the rest of the harvest would sustain life, the Israelites even had a specific harvest celebration called Day of First Fruits. It is the same as the Festival of Weeks, the Festival of Harvest, and Pentecost, Exodus 34, 22, and Numbers 28 and 25. In the New Testament, the concept is reversed. God gives us the first fruits of his Spirit. Romans chapter 8, verse 23. Verse 36, as it is also written in the law, we will bring the firstborn of our sons and of our cattle, of our herds, and of our flocks to the house of our God, to the priests ministering there. The first fruits principle applied to the firstborn male of children and livestock as well. This concept seems alien to modern readers, but it speaks to the life of gratitude that biblical law wishes to cultivate. The reason the firstborn are to be brought to the house of our God is for a redemption ritual as specified in Exodus chapter 13, verses 1 through 16. Verse 37, moreover, we will bring to the storerooms of the house of our God, to the priests, the first of our ground meal, of our grain offerings, of the fruit of all our trees, and of our new wine and olive oil. And we will bring a tithe of our crops to the Levites, For it is the Levites who collect the tithes in all the towns where we work. This verse offers a sweeping summary of all first fruits expectations specified so far. Now we come to something new, tithes, which have not been mentioned in the book of Nehemiah until this point. But what's new in Nehemiah is well rehearsed in the law of Moses. The Levites were to be wholly devoted to the functioning of the temple. As such, they weren't to be growing crops like everyone else. Ideally, that is constant in Nehemiah 13:10. The giving over of the tithes, 1/10 of crops, etc., to the landless Levites allowed them to focus full time on their work in the temple. Numbers 18:24 and Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 1 through 2. Tithes also provided sustenance for the fatherless and widows. Deuteronomy chapter 14, verses 27 through 29, and chapter 26, verses 12 through 15. Verse 38. A priest descended from Aaron is to accompany the Levites when they receive the tithes, and the Levites are to bring 1/10 of the tithes up to the house of our God, to the storerooms of the treasury. When Ezra led the second wave of returnees from exile in 458 BC, he took great care to ensure proper handling of funds. Ezra chapter 8, verses 24 through 34. The same seems to be evident here. The direction concerning 1/10 of the tithes shows how meticulous Nehemiah was in obeying the law of Moses. The concept is founded on the command in Numbers 18 and 26. Just as the people, in general, were expected to tithe to support the Levites' service in the tabernacle and temple, so also the Levites themselves were expected to tithe from the tithes they had received. Verse 39. The people of Israel, including the Levites, are to bring their contributions of grain, new wine, and olive oil to the storerooms, where the articles for the sanctuary and for the ministering priests, the gatekeepers, and the musicians are also kept. We will not neglect the house of our God. The words translated grain, new wine, and olive oil occur together frequently in the Old Testament in various contexts of blessings. Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 13, and woe, example chapter 28, verse 51. Since these commodities would tend to arrive in large batches at harvest time, appropriate storerooms were needed. The rebuilt temple indeed had such rooms, Ezra chapter 8, verse 29. The task of their oversight was the responsibility of 4 Levites in particular. First Chronicles chapter 9, verse 26. These rooms were abused later in Nehemiah's absence. Nehemiah chapter 13, verses 6 through 13. Thank you so very much for listening. Stay safe and may God bless.